Morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to today's webinar. I see we have multiple people already joined. We have more colleagues in the waiting room. So I'm using these first few minutes to welcome our partners for today's webinar. This is the third in the GCCM's series of sandbox webinars, as we call them, spaces where we explore ideas, collaborations, concepts with partners. And today we are very pleased to be joined by colleagues from the Luxembourg Institute of Social and Economic Research. We have been working closely together on our Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative over the last couple of years, and we will be showcasing some of the work from that initiative here today, but also look at some of the exciting new ways in which LISER has taken forward the collaboration and is expanding its work in social and economic modeling related to climate mobility. My name is Sarah Rosengartner. I'm the Deputy Managing Director at the GCCM, and I'm joined by my colleagues Nikki Stauman, who will be moderating today's session, and Emma Winkley, who will be presenting some of our work in the Greater Caribbean. And without further ado, I would like to set the scene for today's meeting by sharing some of the background to how it came to us collaborating with LISER and why we engaged in this work on climate mobility modeling and trying to anticipate future trends and hotspots of human movement in response to climate impacts. Most of you will recall the famous motto, so to speak, of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030, which is leave no one behind. And what this motto really encapsulates was this idea that we can look at national statistics and averages and understand something about where countries are making progress and where the need for further development and efforts is. But these national statistics and averages tend to also hide big differences within countries. And so one of the key, I would say, insights or efforts in the SDG agenda was to say we need to look at these differences, how are different geographies faring, how are different groups of people faring within countries, and how do we measure progress and account for these differences across territories. Our work on climate mobility is very much in that same spirit. We want to understand where are the geographies and the people that are most affected by the impacts of climate change, both because they're particularly exposed to the hazards that are growing, but also because they are particularly vulnerable due to their economic circumstances, their political circumstances, and other factors. And so part of this effort of modeling climate mobility dynamics is to better understand the geographic dimension and to better understand where the locations and where the hotspots of climate mobility, as we call them, will be located. The second rationale for doing the climate mobility modeling efforts is really to help decision makers start thinking not just about the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but to have a longer term time horizon for planning, for anticipating potential changes in the future, and to use those projections to build different scenarios and to plan for different potential scenarios. What we know is that modeling does not give us certainty. It doesn't give us a clear path to the future, but it gives us potential trajectories. And that can be helpful for governments, for community stakeholders to start wrapping their mind around what may lie ahead and how they could be prepared for different potential futures. And lastly, the modeling effort has been a way to really have an entry point for conversation with different stakeholders, bringing together colleagues across different sectors. We have done this in the context of our Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. We have done this in the context of our Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative, where we've engaged colleagues from the development world. I see our colleague from the World Bank is just introducing ourselves, and it's great to have you with us, Anna. Colleagues from UNDP, colleagues from the climate world, UNFCCC, colleagues from the IOM and the migration and displacement space, and having modeling projections as kind of a common information point that actors with different backgrounds, with different sectoral entry points to this issue can kind of come together around and jointly make sense of. So we're very pleased to have been able to work with different modeling approaches, different partners over the last 5 years. And I owe a word of gratitude to our colleagues at the Columbia University Climate School, Alex de Sherbenin at CISN, who I don't think has been able to join us today, but who has been a steadfast partner in identifying different modeling approaches. And I remember well, in September 2023, we had a workshop in New York where Michael presented, and we had a number of colleagues present different ways of modeling climate mobility. And we were really looking at what are the approaches out there, what are the pros and cons of different ways of going about trying to anticipate the ways in which climate change and the movement of people interact. And as we all know, these are not linear connections. And one of the strengths that we found in the LISER model is that it really captures not just the direct connection between climate impacts and people's decisions to move. It doesn't just look at this kind of more mechanistic, let's say, understanding, but really has a broader perspective by anticipating effects in the economy. And we all know that economic factors are a very important driver of movement, and is, again, not the only one, but certainly an important factor in decision making about migration, both within countries and across borders. I don't want to go into too much detail about the model because I'm sure we will hear more about it. But just to say, another reason why we wanted to work with LISER was that it has a global reach, but also, again, like the ability to look at different scales of geographies and to capture localized dynamics as well as broader cross-border dynamics, which was very attractive to us. I say a few more words about the GCCM. I think most people on the call will know us as an entity, but for those who have not joined us before, we're a global entity housed at the United Nations UN Office for Project Services. We work across Africa, the Greater Caribbean, and the Pacific region, really with an emphasis on aligning policy responses, political momentum, data and evidence, finance, and solutions around the communities that are most affected by the climate crisis. So our focus is on community transition. How do we enable those communities to transition in the context of the climate crisis, whether it's staying in place and supporting adaptive capacities for people to remain, whether it's supporting the movement of some members of a community to support the adaptation of everybody else, or it is looking at the potential relocation of whole communities. But so our focus is really on how do we identify those who are most in need of support, and how do we array the international and national systems of support around their needs and their priorities. We are very pleased to have been working in this endeavor with a broad range of partners, governments, including philanthropy, other UN organizations, the development banks, many civil society partners, very active youth networks, city networks. So this is really a broad ecosystem of actors, and we're very pleased to have the ecosystem come together next month, June 18, 19, at our Berlin Climate Mobility Forum, which will be the opportunity to jointly unveil and discuss a set of global climate mobility principles that we have been now discussing with member states for the last few months, and where we're trying to galvanize some of the insights gleaned from engagement across different regions, from the existing body of knowledge, of policy, of normative guidance that has come from international courts in the recent years. So it's an important moment. We know the international system is undergoing profound changes. Multiple overlapping crises are grabbing our attention daily, and yet we are trying to really keep the momentum, politically speaking, but also when it comes to the technical work, to keep focused on this issue, or this essential nexus of climate change and human mobility. And our webinar today is very much part of this. So again, I'm thankful for all of you to make the time to join us. I hope you will be active in the discussion periods. Please share questions. Please share your comments and thoughts. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our partner from LISER, Dr. Frédéric Dauquier, who will be welcoming from the LISER side. And he's a renowned economist, very well known to, I think, everybody working in the migration space. And we're very pleased to be partnering with you. So Frédéric, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the nice word, and thanks to all those who participate in this webinar. Of course, big thanks to GCCM for organizing this event, which is dedicated to this CliC model, CliC dashboard that built here. We are very grateful for GCCM's continued engagement and support around evidence-based approaches to climate mobility and adaptation policy. So just a few words about the genesis of CliC. So CliC was born, I would say, almost 10 years ago, when Mirao Burzinski and myself were both working abroad at a foreign university. And it was a purely academic project, I would say. Maybe I can say that we were increasingly dissatisfied with many existing studies and newspaper articles predicting massive long-distance migration from the global south to the global north in response to climate change, while the reality is different. So what we observe in the data is that migration is very costly. And when you impoverish the poorest people on Earth, they do not migrate more, they migrate less, in fact. So at least non-forced migration decreases with adverse shocks because the poorest households cannot afford to move. And this is really what led us to develop a model that accounts for migration constraints. So we designed this CliC model to reproduce observed migration flows from the recent past with this ambition of projecting future climate mobility in a way that remains grounded in real-world migration behavior. And a few years after, in a way, Mirao and myself also became migrants. And we met in Luxembourg again, like an old couple, I would say, that eventually finds its way back together. We both ended up at LISER in Luxembourg. So LISER is the Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research, and we have this dual or double mission at LISER of producing good research, so academic excellence, with societal impact. And I'm particularly managing this LISER policy lab that we created a few months ago, which promotes evidence-based policy making, so a stronger connection between research and public action. So we continue to work on CliC. We joined forces with Alexandra Szymanska, that you will see in a few minutes probably. And we developed the first pilot version of the CliC dashboard. And today I can say that it has become one of the flagship projects of the Policy Lab. And I strongly believe that it helps improve the spatial targeting of adaptation policies. So over the years, we've had the opportunity to collaborate with a growing number of partners, universities, the Ministry of Cooperation here in Luxembourg, the World Bank, and of course GCCM, which has progressively become an important and strategic partner for us. I think what makes this collaboration with GCCM important is really our shared commitment to translating scientific evidence into policies to manage climate-driven migration, but also to reduce the poverty implications of climate change. So to me, I'm very happy to attend this webinar. It's not only here about presenting a model or a dashboard, but it's also about discussing about practical use in different regions of the world and answering, of course, your questions. So thank you again for inviting us. Thank you for being here. And I very much look forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Frédéric, and again to the colleagues from LISER for joining us today. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to my colleague, Nikki Stauman, to take us through today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Dr. Docuyer. Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it may be for everyone. Sarah said, my name is Nikki Stoneman. I'm the Knowledge Coordinator at the Global Center for Climate Mobility, and we're very grateful for all of you for joining us today. And as my colleagues have discussed earlier, this session is going to explore how data and modeling and analytical tools can support more evidence-informed action, as you were just saying, on climate mobility and adaptation. So we really want to take a moment to reflect on how forward-looking evidence can support policy dialogue and preparedness and long-term planning through evidence, but also through grounded realities that people have. So we're very pleased to be joined today. Thank you already, Sarah, for speaking, and also by my colleague, Ms. Emma Winkley, and Dr. Alexandra Simanska, and Dr. Michal Brzezinski. They're going to share perspectives from ongoing research, modeling, and policy engagements. And for the flow today, we're going to begin with presentations from our different speakers, have a dashboard demonstration or moderated discussion, and then conclude with some reflections and give you all a chance to ask some questions. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Emma to focus on the Greater Caribbean, on the data and analytical tools for regional and national engagement.
Thank you
Over to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and thank you to Sarah and our colleagues at LISER for being here today. I have been working side by side with Michal for, especially during 2024, so it's really great. It feels like a nice celebration of those efforts. So hopefully you can all see my screen. Yes? Okay, great. So we will be having a presentation by the LISER colleagues, as we've just heard, about the overall CliC dashboard, which presents modeling projections from a global model. But before we get there, we want to present a really tangible use case of the way in which this global model has supported regional planning in the Greater Caribbean region. And so this work was carried out, like I said, mostly from 2023 to 2024 under the Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative. And this initiative was a partnership of GCCM with the Association of Caribbean States, as well as other UN agencies and the World Bank. And I think it provides a really excellent case study of the ways in which modeling projections can both complement and supplement other forms of evidence, like evidence from the ground, carried out through fieldwork and consultations. And so I'm really pleased to take you through the approach that was a three-pronged approach that we carried out at GCCM through the Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative, for short, GCCMI, which combines modeling projections with field work and a desk review, as well as consultations with and validation by stakeholders and experts to produce an agenda for action, which really shows the translation of evidence into policy recommendations. So I will take us through this approach briefly by starting with a discussion of the modeling projection. Well, I think we're clear on who GCCM is at this point, so I'll skip this slide. But I also really encourage you, this will just be a brief overview, and I really encourage you all to read the full set of projections that came out of this modeling work in the Great Caribbean Shifts Report, which can be found online at the GCCMI digital dashboard platform. So like I said, this is a global model, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the modeling methodology because that's why we have LISER colleagues on the call. But just to give you an understanding of how it works before we dive into how we used it, the model is a global model that we then could basically constrain for the Greater Caribbean region. So we present findings at the regional level as well as at the national level from this model. We looked at it from 3 different climate scenarios, including the coupling of RCP and SSP scenarios, as well, and looked at different ranges of movement. So as Michal will explain later on, this model primarily considers, it's an econometric model that considers the impacts of climate change on the world economy, and basically how, when economic opportunities shift, how people might move or not move in response to those shifting opportunities. Importantly, the model only looks at, or specifically looks at, permanent, regular economic migration. And so, of course, that is the findings that I will be presenting today for the Greater Caribbean region. Again, I will leave this to Michal to explain in greater detail, but the model provides snapshots of different timeframes, and it can also give us disaggregated results for different types of population groups along the lines of gender, education level, as well as age. So we paired these modeling results, which gave us an indication of what might be coming in the future with a consideration of what is going on currently. And to do that, we carried out field work across 14 communities in 6 different countries, including 3 Caribbean islands, as well as 3 mainland or continental countries, and did this from the perspective of different types of communities, including rural, urban, and coastal communities that served or were positioned as origin versus transit versus destination context in order to get a better understanding of these different dynamics and the relationship between climate change and people's decision making in these different settings. And this fieldwork was actually carried out by my colleague, Nikki Stauman. So she is also on the call if you have questions about that. So this enabled us to get a better understanding of the ways that climate change was impacting people's daily lives and their perceptions of those impacts, as well as how climate was impacting their decision making and their aspirations for the future. So those were the 2 components of our approach, and we synthesized the results of both the current realities and the future projections, and we brought them to a wide variety of stakeholders. I think it amounted to over 1,200 people across the Greater Caribbean region, specifically the 25 ACS member states, and discussed in order to validate the findings of this research. And we determined that there was a lot of overlap between what we found in the fieldwork versus what we found in the modeling versus what participants in stakeholder consultations told us. And I think that's really important because it demonstrates how the modeling projections and modeling at large as a specific type of evidence-based can complement other sources of information. This is some of the key areas of overlap that we found between the three prongs of our approach. The first being that mobility is driven by a complex set of factors. It is a multi-dimensional decision-making process. And while fieldwork demonstrated that non-economic factors played a very big role in people's experiences of climate change, people also were certainly having impacts on their livelihoods. Many people in the region who had already moved indicated moving for family reasons, but employment was also top of mind for people as well. At the same time, people are strongly attached to place, and there's a significant desire to remain at home and not to be displaced by climate change, and that is strongly, I think, shaped by identities and cultures and livelihoods tied to specific resources, natural resources, ecosystems, land, and places at large. And at the same time, as I already mentioned, people also indicated that there is a mounting economic and non-economic loss and damage, and that this contributes to both different constraints and different levels of constraints and agency in the different mobility or immobility or leaving and staying behaviors. And I think this is important because this helped us to put into perspective some of the modeling projections we have about outmigration versus immobility. So this is how all three came together, and we essentially use these key insights and the intersection of these insights versus where they did not intersect to inform how we thought about policy recommendations. So the actions at different levels of governance that we were going to suggest for the region at large. So in order to inform that process, we brought in a final layer, which was understanding where the region stands already. There's already significant momentum within the region to address climate mobility through specific frameworks from a human rights perspective, but also through from a migration governance perspective, which we can see in subregions such as the OECS, as well as the larger region that is part of the Cartagena process. So with all of these different levels of input, we distilled 7 key priorities for action in the Greater Caribbean, largely grouped into 3 categories of supporting adaptation locally, particularly to guard against forced mobility and protect people's rights to stay or the option of voluntary immobility. Followed by protecting rights, which is, of course, relevant to people that are both staying, those that are on the move or in transit, and those that arrive in destinations and are seeking to integrate into host communities, as well as acting together with different levels of solidarity between different levels of governance, including local through national, partnerships between cities that are going to be both destinations and origins for people on the move, as well as between countries that might be receiving cross-border mobility flows in the context of climate change, as well as the international community that is responsible for both mitigating climate impacts as well as mobilizing funding to help address some of those impacts in the Greater Caribbean. So that is a quick overview. I think I'm almost running out of time, but I want to get to really the heart of this conversation today to help demonstrate how we took the very specific insights that were generated by the modeling, coupled that with the field work to produce specific and very tailored policy recommendations. So as Mikhail will walk through, the model is able to tell us the economic impacts of climate change on the world, but also on the Greater Caribbean region. And for this project, the model, we looked at it under two different climate scenarios. This map here on the right is a picture or a map of GDP loss per pixel under the Rocky Road scenario, which is considered the most pessimistic scenario in this model in this project. Under this scenario, losses on average across the region could be up to 20% of GDP per capita. You'll notice that you'll see largely the brighter pinkish red, which is more extreme losses, primarily around low-lying coastal areas, and areas that are most exposed to temperature extremes, whereas you see some inland areas actually kind of winning out on changes in climate from an economic perspective. And what this showed us is that it's not completely bleak, right? Like opportunities are shifting, and when opportunities shift, there is an opportunity to harness that mobility and as people move to take advantage of those opportunities for sustainable development for the region at the national level, at the community level, but also for the region at large. So we recognize that as we were hearing from fieldwork, that economic damage is occurring already. We recognize that it is projected to occur by 2050 as well, and determined that a set of actions would be needed to address some of these impacts and particularly protect some of the people that will be facing more extreme poverty in the long run. So the group of actions that really speak to this are action number 2, which is enabling positive adaptation journeys, action number 5, which is responding collectively to loss and damage, and action 6, which is integrating climate mobility into regional development strategies. So I encourage you, I think I'm trying to be conscious of time, so I encourage you to read through these specific actions on our website, and I'll just move on to one of the next projection points that was important for our policy recommendations. And that is, of course, the projection on the amount of people that could be mobile. So by 2050, the model projects under the Rocky Road scenario that up to 8.2 million people could leave their home permanently. And what's more important here is that the model explains that 60% of that movement will happen internally. And so what that really told us is that national level planning and really whole of society approaches that bring together different sectors to address national level population shifts is going to be key to enabling positive adaptation of people both staying and those on the move. So again, I'm just bringing out some examples of policy recommendations that we suggested in support of this finding. Specifically under positive adaptation journeys, we recommended holistic approaches to urban planning that consider both future risk as well as current risk, as well as the current needs of populations and projected needs. And also importantly, advancing rights-based approaches. We heard from specifically, this is again where the fieldwork and consultations was a helpful input to complementing the modeling findings. We heard very specifically that even under internal movement, there was concern from Indigenous communities that their rights and their ability to have protected self-determination within the home country context was jeopardized even moving internally. So we suggested, of course, appropriate responses to supporting integration of all people on the move internally from an equity and justice perspective. Okay, and lastly, the model is able to give us an indication of all of the people that actually might stay based on shifting economic opportunities. So immobility in the model is captured as a deterrence effect, which Mikhail will definitely explain better than I can. But essentially, when climate impacts potential destinations, the migration cost is a bit higher, and for those with lower financial capacity to move actually end up being deterred from moving and staying home. And while this provides an opportunity specifically when we're thinking about shrinking population bases, especially in small islands, this could be an opportunity for, really harnessing populations staying. It also could jeopardize people who face climate impacts at home and push for the risk of trapped populations or people that are unable to move but want to move. And so, again, this informed numerous different policy recommendations in the agenda for action, and specifically those under supporting adaptation in place, as well as and protecting the right to stay and providing options for planned relocation that are respectful of and protective of rights and prioritize inclusive and participatory approaches. So I think that was a lot of information, but hopefully gave you an overview of the way that this information can be used. And we also, it's a great opportunity to have your reflections about our approach as well. But please put any questions in the chat and we can get back to you. And with that, I will pass it back to Nikki to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Emma. And having worked on the field work and seeing the results of the model at the same time and seeing all of these findings coming together, it was really an adventure and also amazing to see how impactful those modeling findings were in developing these policy solutions. So with that, I want to introduce our next speaker to show how some of these results look in real time through a dashboard demonstration on how we can turn data into action. Dr. Alexandra Sismanska, who's a senior officer at the LISER Policy Lab. Over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And let me start with sharing my screen. I will wait for the screen to come up and put some settings on it as well, hopefully. Okay, can you just confirm that you can see my screen and it works? Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, super. So as Frederick has already gave a bit of the introduction at the beginning, it's very important to highlight that this product came out as a tool that we came up with after more than a decade of research of Michał Burzyński and Frederick Doquier and their colleagues on climate change migration. So the tool came with the main assumption to bring the open access to the outcomes, to the results of the projections that the model simulates. So today we are very pleased because it has been exactly 3 weeks back when the full-scale product has been published online. So now everyone can go and explore the dashboard, but also everyone can start benefiting from the data which we make publicly available with a full access to any users that can benefit from the analysis and can benefit from these tangible results. So when you go to the dashboard at the very beginning, what you can find is the knowledge base tool, which works a bit like a Wikipedia. It will give you a bit of the context about the mission, about the project, about the references, the data that has been used. So basically, any question that you might have, you will be able to answer. And now I'm getting just this tool. I don't know what to do because I have just the overlap in my presentation screen with the Zoom banner. And okay, sorry, apologies for that. So you can go and find any answer to the question that you might have later on. But the most important thing for anyone who would like to start using the tool, the only one skill that you need to have is clicking with your mouse. We were aiming to bring the user-friendly interface that will actually be useful to any policymakers, advisors, NGOs, students, and researchers who are looking into these problems and who are interested in exploring this data. So you can share with me via the chat what are actually your main questions and what are the main problems that you are trying to solve. And then I will try during this short demonstration cover hopefully some of these aspects. But basically, I would suggest that we can...
Sorry, Alexandra, just to interrupt, we're not seeing it move on our end. It's a bit frozen, so I don't know if...
Okay, so let me try. So I'm just about to start clicking. So
Okay,
can you
perfect.
see some click on the screen? Excellent. Okay, so how we can start here? So the tool brings you multiple scopes. So we have 6 scopes available. One of them is migration, but also we have the scope which is the poverty, economy, urbanization, total population, and climate damages. And among
Sorry, we
migration,
can't see any clicks happening.
Alexandra, I think the screen is frozen, so you should maybe stop sharing and reshare.
And restart. Okay. Okay, let's try again. Sorry, apologies for that. Can you see it now? Okay, good. Can you confirm that you can see something happening here?
There is a map.
Okay. And do you see now the scope selector at migration?
Yes, it works.
Okay, great, excellent. So apologies. So we have the migration selected, and from the migration, we can work with 4 different types of variables. So we can look at the net migration, we can look at the in-migration, out-migration, and non-movers. Everything we made available in numbers and the percentage. So I suggest that we pick up the out-migration. We look at the moment at all hazards, and we now want to define the location, the geography, where we would like to conduct our analysis. So there are 3 ways how you can spot the place that is of your interest. One is that you go to the selector here and you can start typing with your keyboard. Let's say we want to check the Haiti. So you start typing, and the more characters you put in, the less results you're actually receiving. And then you can go and just click for Haiti. And this is how you land at the Haiti with all of the results. Another way is that if I zoom back toward, is we have here the table, which actually gives you the overview, the aggregates at the continent level. But whenever you click, you zoom down to the next granularity. So under the country, you will find under the continent, you will find the country. Under the country, you will find the regions, and so on. So you can also find the Haiti this way. And what we find is the most fancy and what we like personally the most is just clicking. So you can also just click on the map, you select the South America, and then you just, with your mouse, you zoom a bit in, you spot Haiti, you click, and you're also getting there. So at the helicopter overview, you are getting the total number of out migrations, which gives you the number of people who are moving outside the country. And you see their breakdown, their decomposition in terms of the gender, age, and education. Whenever you are interested in, you can work on the specific gender group, on the specific age population, or on the specific education background of those people. So this is one variable, which is the out migration. You can also check, for example, at the same time for the same country, the in migration. So what we spot here for Haiti is that the in migrations are negative. So what does the negative value of in migration means? Basically, in non-climate change scenario, 17.4 thousand people would decide to move in to Haiti. But due to the climate change, under RCP 7.0 that I have pre-selected here, and in the time horizon 2090, 17.4 thousand people will not move in. So when you go at the end to the net migration, you will get here the outcome of the calculation, which is your in migration minus out migration. So it sums up how many people the country will lose. But as you can see here, at the regional level, variables like the values are mixed. So we have both positive and negative, which basically means that some regions are gaining people, some regions are losing people. And the same goes down to the pixel level. So everything, every region is available at the 5x5 pixel, 5x5 kilometers pixel, and you can dive deep into this level of granularity with your analysis. Another interesting scope that may also be explored by our dashboard is the climate damages. So let me zoom back to the word first and then show you what we made available for you. So in terms of the variable, you can explore the climate damages looking either at the temperature impact, sea level impact, floods, droughts, and heat waves. So if we, for example, pre-select the sea level here, you will see that the activated pixels are really at the coastal zone, which totally makes sense, right? Because these are the places which are going to be impacted by the sea level rise. So if now, for example, let's say we are interested in Africa, in some investments, protection, whatever the attention here is, we select on Africa, but we still don't know where we should really dig into, where the biggest losses are. So we can sort here the outcomes at the country level by the size of the impact. So we are getting as the most impacted here country, Mauritania. So if I click at Mauritania, I'm getting the national zoom here, and very naturally we are getting the spot which looks very dark and probably which is going to be the most impacted by the sea level rise. So if we click here, we are discovering that now, if we would like to know how many people will move out from this territory, actually, this region, the big region here, is not heavily populated, so we don't have so many people living. But just here in the middle, we have another region, out of which 803,000 people almost will be living by the end of 2090 under RCP 7.0 scenario, leaving the region due to the climate change. So this is very important. If you do the analysis at the country level, migration out gives you the value of people who will be moving, the aggregate, moving out of the country. If you dive deep and you go to the regional level, the migration out gives you the number of people who will be moving the region, which basically means that you combine here both migration, national migration outside the region, as well as international migrations. So this is another example of the scope that you can study using the dashboard. What is also very interesting, and what Michał and Frederick highlight in their scientific research, is the aspect of the climate poverty. So we speak, so many people will move, so many people should move, but many people will not be able to move due to these financial constraints. So if we look at the poverty, we can actually look at the regular poverty and at the extreme poverty. So if we just decide now, okay, let's have a look at Asia and let's check what's happening there. So not surprisingly, two countries at the top, we see India and Bangladesh. So if we zoom into Bangladesh now, we may quickly get a message that everything, all the problem about extreme poverty is among 7 regions. So we expect to have 30 million of people being moved from poverty to extreme poverty by the end of the century. We estimate that this is the number, like in terms of the direction and the magnitude of this number. And we also see what are the most impacted regions. So if we select one of them, for instance, this one, what you can also do, you can go and check which climate hazards actually are causing this. So if I click here, for example, floods, we see, okay, this is not due to floods. But if I click temperature, I find out, oh, right, there is a lot happening here due to the temperature, but also there is a lot of happening due to the agriculture. So this is how you can go and explore the tool, and this is how you can dive deep into a very local context and try to get some insights behind the problem that the local community might face in that particular country. And I think the last probably what I will be able to show you today, but we are very happy to have any further follow-ups if this is something that interests you. We also suggested here a couple of presets. So presets give you immediately some pre-selection of the variables which we find quite useful for the wider audience. So if we take, for example, a tertiarily educated population, and if we go again to Africa, for example, we can do a bit of the sorting to spot like what are the countries who are losing the most of highly educated people. So countries who will basically like countries where highly educated workers will decide to leave the country. So if we, for example, select here Mali, we can quickly grasp that there is some hotspot here. So I want to figure out what's happening here, and I would like to know better who is going to be the most impacted here. So if I zoom in, I see immediately that this is the capital, Bamako, and I see that this is about 370,000 people, highly educated young people, leaving that place. So if someone would ask, okay, but who is the story about? Is it about young professional men or women? I can also play and check. So basically, I can unselect the male here, leave only female, and we find out that 2/3 of this story is about women. And now we would like to know, okay, is it the story of the young professionals? We unselect the mid-age workers, and we find out that actually this is mainly about young women who will be leaving that place. We can also check if the same story remains, for example, for the people with secondary education, and we find, yes, it's still the same. So you can actually explore here the data in the way that corresponds with your needs and the focus of your interest. But if we select, for example, the primary education, you see that the story is the opposite. And actually, if I now scroll down to Bamako, we are spotting that there is almost 500,000 people who would decide to move in non-climate change scenario, but due to the climate change, these almost 500,000 of individual young women will not be able to move. So these are like a few case studies examples that I just aim to share with you today, but we remain very available to discuss any other case studies or help you with onboarding to the tool later on. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was very interesting and really happy to see it live and all come together. And I'm going to quickly pass the floor over to Michal to share the introduction to the approach, model to policy insight, and looking at how you refine the model and the different policy simulations that can be done in the future. And I just want to ask our next speakers to be mindful of time so we can make sure to have time for the Q&A and for our audience to participate as well. Over to you, Michal.
Perfect. Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you see the slides?
Yes,
animation, do they work? Okay, perfect. So thank you so much. I'm very
Perfect.
much excited to show you the CliC model, which is the backbone, says behind the CliC dashboard. So it's a joint work with many co-authors, including Alexandra. We simply wanted to have a very academic, in the beginning, very academic story about the potential consequences of climate change for international migration of people, for the actual distribution of income around the world, and the measures of poverty and inequality implied by that. And this was our initial motivation to do this research, but in a specific way. We wanted to include multiple climatic factors in one model, very detailed geographical resolution, and to have different characteristics of individuals. For this purpose, we built something which in economics we call a spatial general equilibrium model of the world economy. And it simply means there are many markets that are interacting with each other within the model. So for example, we have production where firms can decide to produce in agriculture, industry, or services. Those products are then consumed by individuals subject to their preferences, subject to prices, which are also computed within the model, and subject to individual incomes, which are then determined on the labor markets, where people sell their skills, proxied by education levels, subject to the productivity distribution across space. This is how we compute wages. All of this is embedded in an international trade network where people can decide to consume goods domestically produced or imported from any other country in the world. So those trade matrices
Nicole,
are well suited to us
breaking
about the
up a
impact of
bit.
climate geography. Okay, I'm breaking up a bit. Let's try like this. The geography, that is the world being divided into 202 countries, which are then divided into 2,300 administrative units, which are then divided into more than 2.7 million pixels. Small pieces of land, 5 by 5 kilometers large at the equator, that actually give you a distribution of local economies that are characterized by demographic, economic, and climatic factors. And this is super important from the perspective of modeling, because we have now a very good look at this unequal overlap of economic activity, demographic intensity, and climatic hazards. Talking about the latters, we have a couple of climate hazards working within the model, which is high temperatures affecting workers' productivity. We have sea level rise. We have disasters that affect local amenities through droughts, floods, cyclones, and heat waves. We also have crop yields that affect agriculture productivity. And to give you a bit of flavor of what are those main channels through which climate affects the economy and migration, here you can see an animation of the damages to labor productivity through extreme temperatures all over the world, simulated, plotted over time and across RCP scenarios, so the climatic scenarios. And without a big surprise, you can see which areas of the world are mostly affected with, losses at the end of the century going as high as 70, 80% of workers' productivity. Then the sea level rise, of course, as already Alexandra shown us, is a coastal thing, and there are over time going to be important losses, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. If there is no adaptation to sea level rise, prices will be flooded. And then the last thing is probably the most important element of disasters, that is the loss in amenities due to droughts. As you can see, both developing and developed regions are significantly affected. This includes access to water, this includes livability of different places. But the main focus of our model are actually people, individuals who are grouped into 24 adult groups by 20-year age groups, 3 age groups times 2 gender groups times 4 education groups. And this is fundamental because we know from economic and non-economic literature that decision-making differs across those socio-demographic characteristics, especially when we talk about migration. So people within our model, they are utility maximizers. So they select the place of residence that brings them the highest level of utility. And if this place appears to be different than the place of birth of those people, people decide to migrate. So migration in our model can be international across country borders, can be national within country borders, but across those administrative units, or local within admin units across pixels. And this is very important to realize that actually all the migration flows in our model are bilateral. So they are origin times destination specific. So we have migration matrices for international across countries, for national across admin units that give you a very detailed picture of where people are going to move. But that's not all, because those movements are also individual type specific. So you have 24 collections of those migration matrices. So there is a lot of data in there. All right, so the final element of the calibration of the model is setting the forward-looking scenarios, so the projections for the future. And here we are 100% consistent with the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, using their data on demographic and macroeconomic projections, for example, using fertility rates, mortality rates, education shares, and productivity growth from the SSP scenarios provided by the IPC. So if you read the IPC report, their results, their scenarios, we are 100% compatible with that. So we use this model to run those forward-looking scenarios for different intensities of global emissions. Those scenarios by IPC are sort of labeled as optimistic, neutral, pessimistic, or catastrophic scenarios. So these are the scenarios that we are simulating. But then all the data that you can see in our outputs, these are the comparisons of the climate scenarios and no climate scenarios. So artificial scenarios that we create, which we call RCP00, that shut down all the climate hazards over time. So climate is constant over time over the 21st century and equal to what was observed in year 2010. So we sort of stop climate hazards, and the comparison is between those climate and non-climate scenarios. The difference between the two is exactly the direct impact of climate on demographic, migration, and macroeconomic variables. So let's see how those impacts look like. You can check all of this yourself at CliC dashboard. Here you have it in a more sort of colorful and animated version. So let's start with the economy. Changes in gross domestic product per capita over time across climatic scenarios. You see that, unfortunately, without big surprise, the regions that are mostly vulnerable to climate damage are the ones at low latitudes. The developing countries that contributed the least to global emissions are suffering the highest losses in terms of their economic implications. So this is a very pessimistic story. And to give you a macroeconomic or aggregated overview, we are talking about losses that can top up until more than 30% in terms of GDP at the end of the century in the most pessimistic scenarios. But once again, this is an aggregated number for the whole world. If you look at some details, you know there is a lot of heterogeneity across countries and also across continents, as you can see here in the graph below. So those changes in the economic environment, they are one of the major causes why people would like to move out or migrate because of climatic reasons in our model. A big disclaimer here, we are talking about long-term, permanent, voluntary climate migration. So in the model, we don't say anything about temporary migration, circular migration, short-term displacement. No, this is long-term perspective, a long-term model. But you can still see a lot of action happening in this long-term climate migration projections. In this animation, you can see the net climate migration across time and across climatic scenarios for the pixels. And two important messages can come out here. First of all, the North countries, so the developed world, is mainly the destination for climate migrants. So you can see it in those green and blue colors. Whereas the low latitudes developing countries are mainly sending climate migrants. And these are the warm colors, yellow and red. But still, the second message is probably even more important, because in those developing countries, you also have many, many regions that are receiving climate migrants, even though those regions are also strongly affected by climatic hazards. We are talking about many places in Central Africa, Southeast Asia, or the Caribbean. There is a lot of internal climate migration, and actually 80% of climate migration that we project is internal within countries. Only 20% of climate migration from our projections is international climate migration, because it's super expensive to go to move in the long distance. So a couple of aggregates here. Once again, we are talking about hundreds of millions of people that are actually motivated to move out because of climatic reasons. But at the same time, hundreds of millions will be discouraged from moving, immobilized because climate. So in total, when you look at the numbers, well, there are not that many people who are actually moving out internationally because of climatic reasons. Well, from the perspective of developed countries, there are dozens of millions. But from the perspective of the sending countries, the poor South, this is a drop in the ocean. That is why, even though talking about climate migration, climate mobility is an important thing, that's why we're here, probably the elephant in the room, the most important topic is actually climate-induced poverty. And this is the main headline of our research. What we find is that because of this immobility, because of the fact that people cannot afford moving out, many people are trapped in the places where they are exposed to the maximum extent of climatic hazards, climatic damages. Their incomes, livelihoods are damaged. So you can see that actually climate poverty is the thing that we should be talking about as seriously as climate migration. And to give you some aggregated numbers, we are talking about hundreds of millions of people moving from non-poverty to poverty only because of climatic reasons over the 21st century. This is like 3% of global population when poverty today is like 6% of total population of the world, and we have, the Sustainable Development Goals being implemented in the last decades. The distribution across continents is once again very, very, very heterogeneous, very different. So to sum up, we of course know that climate change will be the game changer in terms of the macroeconomy, in terms of prosperity of many areas of the world, and that is why the CliC dashboard has been constructed to raise awareness that climate change is not a joke, and we should really focus on the potential consequences, especially at the local level. We also know that at the current geopolitical situation, climate migration is not probably going to be a useful adaptation strategy for many people. Only a handful of people, only the minority will be able to escape significantly climate damages, unless we help those people to move out and we sort of try to encourage them to move. So probably the easiest way to solve the climate problem is simply to stop emissions. And still, painting this very grim and pessimistic picture, there is a silver lining in this cloud that the pretty neutral scenario of RCP 4.5 is still feasible. And if the policies, green policies, are implemented today. So I'll leave you with this conclusion, and please have a closer look at the dashboard. Thank you so much for your attention. Shall we also move right away to the forward-looking thing, or you, Nikki, would like to have some stop around here?
I think it's okay to move ahead into that. And as Estelle had written in the chat, if people have questions, start putting them in the chat and we can select those to discuss in the Q&A. But yes, thank you so much if you want to start the next presentation.
Yes, perfect. So let's move on. So, the life of a researcher is mainly refining your work, and it's constant refinement. This is exactly what we are doing with CliC. So you have the product in front of you, but still we are already working on some improvements because in the last years we have.
Sorry, Michal, I just want to let you know if you can keep it a lot shorter so we have time for the Q&A, just about 5 minutes to quickly brief everyone on this. Thank you so much.
Because we realized the quality of data, especially climate data, has improved immensely over the years, and we found some ways of improving modeling so that you can get better information and more precise estimates of climate migration. So we have already started to work on the follow-up project, which we call CliC More for model revision. The new model will include a couple of refinements. First of all, geography, which, as you know, is probably one of the most important elements of the model. We want to include more dependent territories, more administrative units to be more detailed about this internal climate migration, which is the key in the discussion, and improve the spatial resolution from 5 by 5 kilometers to 1 by 1 kilometer rasters, which will give you something like 60 million pixels. We check the data, we check the algorithms, it will work. The second thing we want to improve is the population distribution and the net migration period. From 20 years, that is right now, we will go down to 10 years, which will sort of double the number of sociodemographic groups we have within the model. Then, what is related to this more detailed pixel resolution is the need to model explicitly the fact that people might not live and work in the same pixel, which is an automatic assumption in the current version of the model. So we will be modeling explicitly commuting, allowing people to work and live in different pixels. We have already some data collected on commuting zones around the world from Meta, Facebook. We also have a theory that will support us, to do this modeling in an accessible way. Then we will have some quality of life improvements. For example, wages will differ not only by education, but also by age, and most importantly, genders. The gender wage gap will be explicitly modeled within our approach. We will re-estimate damage functions, also including wildfires and hopefully landslides, if it works well. And we'll re-estimate congestion externality within pixels, which is this utility of crowding into pixels into cities. Why is that important? Because we want to do a huge improvement in the probably most important element of the model, that is modeling migration movements. Here we will collect new data. So for the moment, the model is calibrated for 2010 data only, but we are now collecting the data for year 2000, 2010, 2020. The data is not entirely complete, so we will run some machine learning algorithms to do some imputations, but this data will allow us to implement something which we call a nested logic model. It's a model that will allow us to have correlations between utilities of specific regions that are within a bigger region. So let's say admin units within a particular country. Those utilities will be correlated. Now, why do we need this? Well, because in this context, people will select more often the maximizer, so the place that maximizes the utility, which has the highest utility, rather than some other places. This will reinforce the congestion externality, reinforce concentration of climate migrants in the cities, in those places where there are job opportunities. That is why congestion externality is so important, because we want to say something more about the destinations for climate migrants, whether the cities will be capable of hosting those people, whether the infrastructure in education, hospitals, roads, and of course real estate market, is it feasible to withhold this inflow of climate migrants. And remember, this is not only about developed countries, it's mainly about the South countries, about the developing world where 80% of climate migration is happening. So a very short timeline from now, end of this year, hopefully we have migration data collected and imputed. The whole next year, we do the model update with theory. And if all goes well, in 2 years' time, May 2028, we meet once again and we do the introduction of the CliC More online dashboard with a more refined model with the new results. I will leave you with this. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michal, and thank you for keeping it brief. We're going to move on to some questions from the audience. We've selected a few questions for the different speakers, but if we have time for more, sorry, I'm blurry. If we have time for more, we can get to more. So first, I'll just give you, it'll be brief, if you can just take 1 minute to respond, Michal, since you're spotlighted at the moment. Can you explain what are the main limitations of the model, particularly when applying it to different country or local contexts? And if you could just take
each
1
model
minute.
yeah, thank you. So each model has limitations, and definitely our model also has limitations. Probably the most important ones that I see right now is the spatial constraints that we have. We're only up until 5 by 5 kilometers, so we know that within those regions there can be a lot of action already. Talking about small islands, developing states, and sea level rise out there, this is such a localized shock that we have to be significantly more detailed in terms of space. But of course, we have to remember that this is, even though it's a state-of-the-art modeling, we are leaving aside many aspects of reaching migration decisions, for example. All the non-quantifiable, non-tangible elements, we keep them as model parameters, but we want to be sort of more explicit about how those things affect migration movements. For example, network ties, so you have a network in the destination, so it's easier for you to move out. This is something we will have in the new version of the model, or psychological costs, so the networks in things like this. So we see those main limitations, and we are trying to address them in the CliC More new version. Thanks.
Thank you. Am I off mute? And number 2, maybe Alexandra, you could answer this one. What platform or software was used to build the dashboard? And are there any technical requirements users should be aware of to access the dashboard if everyone wants to start engaging with it? I can see there's a lot of enthusiasm in the chat.
Nikki, maybe I can take it for Alexandra. The dashboard has been made by an external company. So this is an pretty easy HTML thing with OpenStreetMaps and mapping rasters on the OpenStreetMap by geolocalization. The whole model is computed and calibrated in R, so an open access software. All the codes will be available when the paper gets published, hopefully in a couple of months, if we are lucky. The only limitation to access the dashboard is actually that you have to have a laptop or a desktop. So you cannot use it on mobile devices yet, but we hope to make this improvement in, I don't want to promise it, but hopefully in 1 or 2 years. But for the moment, you can access it only from laptops and desktops. So this is the main limitation. The rest is having a bit of RAM, because there are some hundreds of megabytes that you will probably be caching when you are using the dashboard. The rest is pretty easy.
Okay, great, thank you. And let's see, maybe Emma, if you want to take this question. How can local communities and grassroots organizations access this data to support vulnerable populations in their communities? Or also, Sarah, if you want to take this question maybe, and Emma, you can actually do the next one. If you're still with us, Sarah.
The question about access to the data?
No, how can local communities and grassroots organizations access this data to support vulnerable populations? So accessing it, but how can it really be used by local initiatives on the ground?
Yeah, so I think there's several web platforms we have done for our Africa Climate Mobility Initiative and the Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative, both web platforms where you can play with the modeling findings and look at some of the findings for your specific geography. There's also the data for Africa is downloadable, and we can put the links in the chat. So you can actually download the modeling data for Africa and look at the projections. I don't know, we'll have to work with LISER on the same for the Greater Caribbean to make the data available. So that is there, and it can be used to advocate with your government. We also, I think, Nikki, you mentioned this in the chat, we have been working with some governments, but obviously not, I'm sure, with all countries that are represented on this call, but have been using this data to start engaging stakeholders, both from government and from civil society in countries, to look at how can this inform, combined with local knowledge, with the observations that people have about the situations in their countries, how can this combined feed into local plans and national plans and policies? And so I think we're also happy to connect on, again, like accessing the data after this webinar, if you have a specific interest, to see how we can support you with this. And also if there are, again, like specific questions that you have that we can help you answer. But it is openly accessible. There's the data platforms that don't allow you to manipulate the data, but they allow you to look at your specific geography. There is the ACMI data that can be downloaded. And again, like I think it can be a source of awareness raising with your constituencies. It can be informing advocacy with your government counterparts. And it can also be potentially a way of, I think, engaging in planning processes at local or national levels.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and just to clarify, this is a lot about how GCCM as our organization houses the data, but LISER's dashboard is separate. And so the CliC data can be accessed also in addition to working with our data on our website and the model results, and the link is in the chat. So Michal, maybe I see your hand is up. Maybe you want to share from your perspective also how that data can help different vulnerable populations on the ground.
Thank you, Nikki. Yes, a very short follow-up on what Zara already said. is that CliC dashboard is full open access, and all the data that you can see there, it will be downloadable. It's not yet unlocked. It will be unlocked when the paper is published very, very soon, hopefully. But everything will be available, from the aggregates at the continent level until the raster maps at the pixel 5x5 level. So there's like 4 terabytes of data. So it's going to be all downloadable.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So Estella, I think, is going to add again in the chat the link to the dashboard and to our dashboard as well, so everyone can access the data. And of course, if you can't find it, please reach out to us afterwards. I want to ask another question to Emma from our audience members. So again, looking at how vulnerable populations are impacted and how we can translate this to action and using the evidence for policy and implementation. How can leaders from underrepresented communities be more meaningfully engaged in shaping climate mobility planning and adaptation decisions so that their voices are reflected in global solutions? So how can we really move that from the local, national, regional level to global solutions? Emma, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Nikki. I will just briefly explain, I think maybe I'll talk from the GCCM perspective, as well as in terms of how we, I think as an organization, think about this question, as well as some of the other kind of approaches that we support, but maybe don't necessarily engage in directly. I think from GCCM's perspective, and I hope that's okay, because I just, if whoever asked this question also wants to clarify kind of the entry point, a specific entry point that you're looking to understand better, I think that would also help me answer the question. But I think from GCCM's perspective, a core component of our work is to understand like the hotspots of climate mobility. So we take this hotspot approach, which is designed to help us determine which geographies, and within those geographies, which population groups are quote unquote more vulnerable, or where overlapping intersectional vulnerabilities produce a situation where interventions need to be designed very specifically tailored to specific population needs. And so in taking that approach, it helps us to narrow down by geography and then by population group or constituency who on the ground we might need to engage. And typically that also is supported by different levels of input, everything from academic experts at different levels, whether it's the local level, the national level, or the regional level, to government officials, but also community-based organizations and leaders. And then I think, of course, the most important part, and part of this question as well, is amplifying those specific voices. And it's a really hard question about what determines meaningful engagement, right? Like, what is meaningful, honestly, especially in a world where climate change is both an urgent planning question, as well as something that needs to consider a long-term planning horizon. So what is meaningful today is also potentially very different than what is meaningful in the future. So I think from our perspective, we try to amplify, those voices by having very direct inputs from local communities into any of the products that we're putting out. So at the national level, I just presented our regional level work that, again, had extensive engagement with community stakeholders that shaped the agenda for action. But then when we work at the national level, we can carry out a similar consultation process, and then our consultation report feeds into the policy recommendations that we put forth at the national level, which we call a climate mobility blueprint, which is intended to support planning, again, at different levels of governance. And so I think in terms of, and hopefully that's helpful. I just wanted to give an example of how we approach this question in terms of meaningful engagement. But I think in terms of strategies that I've seen that are helpful is really coalition and network building. It's easier to tap into opportunities when there's shared resources that are available. And I understand, especially in more remote communities, that this could potentially be more challenging, especially when, geographic isolation is an issue or digital isolation is an issue when you don't have computers or WhatsApp to access, for example, modeling projections or a network of communities that are already in communication with one another. So it's, talking about this digital barrier is very real, and I want to acknowledge that since we're having this conversation around the importance of technology and modeling projections in policy. So again, I think that providing opportunities can be really as simple as building power through networks and coalition building, which is, again, a very key part of GCCM's approach to kind of generating both evidence as well as political momentum around climate mobility issues. So I hope that was a good answer.
Yes, I think it was. And I think you really highlighted the importance of different forms of access, but also different ways to engage with it and different ways to apply and interact with the data. Thank you so much. I just want to conclude today's session with a few closing remarks. We have a few minutes left to sum up this great discussion, and I would like to sincerely thank all of the speakers and the participants. There's so many of you for a really rich and thoughtful discussion and for all of your comments and your questions in the chat. We definitely don't want this to be the end of the conversation. If I can just highlight some important reflections that I felt emerged from the conversation and kind of connecting all of the dots here. As Dr. Michal highlighted, I think what's really important that you pulled out, that one of the key findings from the modeling is that the main headline is not necessarily large-scale international migration, what's always in the headlines politically, but rather the growing risks of climate-induced poverty and immobility, and how this really shows how climate mobility is a combination of factors. It's not just people leaving just because of climate change and crossing a border. The real risk here is climate-induced poverty. And in many contexts, these populations are exposed, as you said, to climate hazards. They might not have the resources or the capacity to move, meaning many people immobile or effectively trapped in these high-risk areas. And relatedly, Dr. Frederick emphasized this also, that limited resources don't necessarily lead to greater mobility. And so in many cases, the lack of resources can actually constrain mobility and reduce people's choices and their agency. And Dr. Alexandra, you also emphasized this, the importance of diving deep into local context to better understand the challenges that populations may face under different climate scenarios. And so a particularly value aspect of the dashboard that we saw, and that we see how different analytical tools presented today, their value is really their accessibility and their ease of use. And as Emma was saying, that this differs across areas and across communities, but hopefully this can make the data more accessible to lots of different people. And so by making complex modeling more user-friendly and adaptable across these contexts, these tools hopefully can help break down the barriers between academia, policymaking, and hopefully to the communities as well. And from the GCCM perspective, Emma, you also highlighted a lot how the modeling can support more tailored and context-specific policy recommendations. And I really loved how you showed those very specific examples. And so rather than producing these generalized projections alone, these approaches actually help identify, right, like local risks or vulnerabilities and different adaptation needs that can inform planning and policies and more resilience building efforts. And so overall, I really think this session, all three of you really highlighted how evidence is the most valuable when it supports practical, applicable decision-making and helps protect people's agency and their dignity, their livelihoods, and their adaptive capacity in the face of climate hazards and climate change. So Thank you again to everyone for joining us today. I hope I summed up some of the key points, and we really encourage participants to continue engaging through our future webinars, the Climate Mobility Academy, and our upcoming Sandbox webinars. So follow us on LinkedIn to find out about the next one, and we look forward to continuing this conversation further. Thank you all so much.